So I should preface this video by saying that it was filmed in several portions. It's the culmination of 3 different batches of black raspberry mead, or it's often called black cat mead, but technically it's known as a melomel, which is mead made with the addition of fruit. Now, I often use whole fruit, but in this case, as is often the case, I use the pulp from black raspberry jam. And the first step in making mead is to sanitize all of your equipment. I like to use this one step. It makes it quick and simple. You just dissolve the required amount in some water and then soak everything for about 15 or 20 minutes. And the nice thing about one step is that you don't have to rinse. And so I use a fermentation airlock. It keeps the fermentation vessel more sterile. It prevents unwanted fungi or bacteria from contaminating the batch. Airlocks create an anaerobic atmosphere, or one without oxygen. Yeast converts sugars into high energy molecules, and it produces the byproducts of alcohol and carbon dioxide. And the primary ingredient in mead is honey. This is honey I've harvested from my bees last summer, and typically mix it in a ratio of about 3 pounds of honey to each gallon of water. You want to make sure it's capped because of moisture content. When it's not capped, it's not ready. It's not at the right moisture content and it'll ferment if you try to harvest it at that point. Raw honey contains plenty of wild yeast, and so it will ferment naturally on its own. But I use boiling hot water to kill off those yeasts, and then I like to add my own. This D47 strain is recommended for dry and fruity wines. And one important thing I've learned when fermenting fruit is to put it in a fine mesh bag. This makes straining, filtering, and cleanup much easier later on. And I like to add weights to the bag to keep all of the fruit submerged. So before I add the yeast and the fruit, I want to get a measure of the specific gravity. Specific gravity lets us know the density of this solution compared to water. And so this number is largely dependent on the sugar content. During alcohol fermentation, yeast converts sugars into carbon dioxide and alcohol. And if we can monitor the decline of specific gravity over time, that will let us know how much alcohol we have at the end of the process. So we measure starting specific gravity here, and then we'll use the final specific gravity later on to calculate that. So this is the point where I added the yeast. I lost the video somehow. I had to wait till everything cooled down just a bit before adding the yeast and the fruit. And I'll fill this chamber with water. And so the airlock keeps air from entering while allowing that CO2 to escape. And yeast can ferment with or without oxygen, but an anaerobic environment kills most competing bacteria or any fungi that would use the sugars to make substances that we do not want. And so when the gas bubbles stop in the airlock, it's time for the next step in the process, which is racking. Now, racking involves siphoning off the clear mead away from the lees, the dead yeast, and their waste products at the bottom of the jar or the bucket. And it's pretty easy to do with one of these automatic siphons. Now before I can do that, I need to remove the fruit. Here's the fine mesh bag I was talking about earlier, making things much easier. All you have to do is place the full container at a higher level than the empty one and get the siphoning going, and then just allow gravity to do the rest of the work. This siphon has a fitting at the bottom that keeps it off of the lees at the bottom of the jar, but you still have to be gentle when inserting it so that you don't stir things up. And so sometimes this can be tricky. You have to just pump it several times, get it primed. and it will continue to flow unless you raise the hose above the bottom of the siphon in the jar. Now I like to do this in a two-step process. Now this was a really small batch I did last year in just a single 1-gallon jar, and I racked it into 2 half-gallon jars. Now I like to do this in case any yeast gets transferred in the siphon. And I'll let this mellow out for a few more weeks. There's no rush. Most of the sediment will drop down to the bottom. And I'll add an airlock during this time just to make sure there's no fermentation that's still taking place. And so you can see a different type here, but they all pretty much work the same to keep the oxygen out but still let CO2 escape. And you have to act quickly at the end of the jar just to make sure not to draw in any sedimentation. And I'll just keep it over here with my other projects. Now this is a different batch. This is much like the one that this video started with, pulp left over from making black raspberry jam with fresh berries over the summer. And so it started out in a 5-gallon bucket, and then I racked it into the 1-gallon jars. Finally, we are ready to bottle it up. I just like to use these flip-top bottles. Makes it really nice. Now I'll be honest, the flavor is not fantastic at this stage. It really needs to age for at least a year, they recommend. And so that's what I do, and it is definitely worth the wait. So now it's time to check final gravity. Although this is a different batch, the numbers are relatively the same. Starting gravity at 1.09, final gravity was 0.996, which equates to 12% alcohol content, which is pretty good for home brew. And so now I can add the date for bottling on my little sheet here. It's been another fun project. Thanks for watching.